Hello, friends. My name is Karen Costa, and in this video, I'm going to be talking about how you can help your ADHD learners land the plane. So, what the heck am I talking about here? I want to thank one of my Twitter friends, Tom Simpson, for sharing this concept with me of landing the plane. This was part of a conversation. Let me actually pause here and read the tweet that's on my screen, that's on the slides. Tom and I were talking, and a bunch of us were talking on Twitter about this issue of extended time as an accommodation for ADHD learners, and that it is a complex topic and extended time is often not enough. And I'll say more about that in a bit. And Tom's response to me in this tweet was, one colleague of mine says, help the student land the plane. Like it might be a little bumpy, turbulent, but it's so much better than the indefinite holding pattern. Yeah. So our ADHD learners are great at takeoff, but they often need help landing the plane. So people with ADHD, people like me, imagine us flying the plane. We're great at takeoff. We're up here. We're looking at the clouds. We're thinking about the meaning of life. We're concerned about the relationships and connections between the people out there in the cabin and the people that we work with. We're, looking at all the different controls. And of course, we're just mesmerized always by this mystery and miracle of flight, of human flight. How did we do this? Perhaps we're thinking about, and so on and so forth, right? There's all these wonderful thoughts going through our heads when it comes time to land the plane. And what I want to emphasize here is that does not, the goal is not to get rid of those types of thoughts. That way of seeing the world, seeing connections and relationships and thinking deeply about things is what makes the ADHD learner so beautiful and so creative and so necessary in our world. I really do feel like our ADHD learners are going to be our guides into this next era, whatever that looks like. So the goal is not to say, stop doing that. Don't do that. Be like a neurotypical pilot here. However, if you're up there looking at all of these wonderful things and having all these lovely thoughts and going from one thing to the next, at some point, you got to land the plane, right? So we're going to talk about how we can help folks do that in this video. All right, let's carry on. So let's come back to that concept of extended time. Extended time alone is not enough. And I'm going to share a couple citations for those of you who are into that sort of thing in the description for the video. Extended time alone is not enough, and it can potentially make things worse. So let's continue this idea. You're up there flying the plane and your ADHD brain is having all these beautiful, creative, innovative thoughts, but it's time to land the plane. And someone says to you, Karen, you know what? I see that you are an ADHD learner. I'm going to give you extended time. I'm going to give you another 10 hours to land the plane. Okay, so that's not going to work, right? We know how that story is going to end. And that's how a lot of extended time stories end. We just give students more time without giving them the structure that we need. So extended time without the appropriate supports and appropriate structures is actually going to potentially do harm to our learners. And I really want you to keep that plain idea in mind. Just giving people more time without supporting them is going to end in not a great way. So ADHD learners need lots and lots of structure. This is not going to come naturally to those of us who have ADHD. And we certainly need unstructured time to be ourselves and be free and be weird and silly and creative. However, we need lots of structure to do things like succeed in a job or succeed in a course, and to get things done that can move us closer to our dreams and to contributing to making things more beautiful and positive in society. We need lots of structure. So a quick story for you about structure, or perhaps the lack thereof. I do great with structure. ADHD learners often do really well when they've got the appropriate structure and support. However, an example of a time in higher education when I didn't have structure was I was in a doctoral program, and I'm not a doctor, is the spoiler alert. I was in a doctoral program. I had finished all my coursework in 2 years and done really well because coursework gives me the structure that I need to succeed. And then I entered the dissertation phase of my doctorate, and there was no structure. I was given an advisor, and it was like, write your dissertation. So for about a year, I was, just spinning, and I was just going into the library databases and going off on these rabbit hole research tangents, which is one of the coolest parts of my brain. But when you're trying to finish something, that doesn't lead to completion. And I didn't have deadlines. I didn't have any structure whatsoever. My advisor kept saying, you need to decide on a topic and finish this. And that was like, you know, it was speaking another language to me. I didn't know how to do that. So I don't have my doctorate, and I'm kind of bummed out about that sometimes. Sometimes I'm not so much, because I know that I'm capable of doing that, but I didn't know I had ADHD at the time. I didn't have a diagnosis, and I didn't have the appropriate supports. So I spent, all this time and money in investing in this, and now that dream has kind of died. So it's really important that we give students structure. I know we want to have open and engaging and flowing classes, and many of us are doing this sort of critical pedagogy where we're opening things up in our classes and developing partnerships with students. And I think that's amazing and important. We have to make sure that we have structure, I think, for all of our students, but in particular for our ADHD learners. So how do we do that? We need to remember that we can provide that choice, and we can provide that flexibility within structure. Okay, so I'm going to give you some examples of how you can do that. The first rule, of course, is no shaming and no trying to turn us into neurotypical learners. Most folks with ADHD have a coexisting condition. Some estimates are up to 99%, called rejection sensitive dysphoria, RSD. So we are just hyper sensitive to negative feedback. The good news is we're also hypersensitive to positive feedback, but it's really important that this is not a shaming process when we're helping students try to land the plane. So you're not going into the cockpit and saying, what is wrong with you? Why can't you do this? Just land the plane. Okay, that's not going to work. We're going to shut down. So we always want to be strengths-based, challenge aware. That's the language that I use. The idea that ADHD is a superpower, like I'm not there. It brings many strengths. But I also think when we talk about ADHD as a superpower, we sometimes leave out how immense this challenge is for people on a daily basis. So I like to use this language of strengths-based, challenge aware. So let's keep that big picture in mind when we're helping students land the plane to finish courses, assignments, to complete their goals. I recommend flexible deadlines. I really want to emphasize that we need deadlines to keep ADHD learners on track. So when are you going to finish this by? That said, those deadlines can be flexible. These deadlines should exist with consistent and caring outreach. So if students miss a deadline, we want to always follow up with them individually, personally, whatever that looks like in a simple and sustainable way for you and your team. We want to reach out and check in and say, okay, this didn't get submitted, this didn't get completed. From a non-judgmental, non-shaming space, what can I do to help? Let's set up a meeting. Let's follow up on this. Weekly checklists with actual dates. So I know in particular, a lot of our online courses sort of reference like these things are due on Sunday so that we can replicate that easily in future terms. ADHD learners need to see specific dates. So one thing that we can do is create one simple checklist for each week or module in our courses that says, this is exactly what needs to get done this week, and this is when it needs to get done. I need specific dates. So in an ideal world, ADHD learners would be able to create that for themselves. Many neurotypical students are able to do that for themselves, but most ADHD learners, that's not how our brains work. We're going to need you to do that and provide that for us, or we're going to need a lot of support for us to learn how to do that ourselves. The other thing I want to emphasize is that as we talk about dates is, and I've been talking about this to my students for years, the difference between due dates, DO, and due dates, DUE. So a due date is this paper is due on October 15th. And many of us give our students the due date, DUE, but we never talk to them about the due date, DO. Our ADHD learners need help establishing the DO due date. When are you going to work on the paper that's due on October 15th? They're going to need help breaking down the steps in completing that paper, and they're going to need help scheduling time to complete those tasks. So you can offer some guidance to them as to what that might look like. And, you know, I say all of this with a grain of salt. If you've got a class of 500 students, I've got faculty I work with who have 1,000 students. Obviously, you're going to approach this differently than if you have a class of 20 students. Please do this in a way that is simple and sustainable for you. And of course, this is we work, not me work. So perhaps there are members of a team that can participate in supporting students with this. And again, so this has to be a collaborative approach, not only with our teams, but with our ADHD learners. So we can say to them, we don't need to baby anybody here. We don't need to pity anybody. What do you think you need to do to get this done? Let's break this down together, right? When do you think is the ideal due date, DO? When would that fit into your schedule to find, 5 research articles that you can include in this paper or whatever the case may be? When are you going to meet with, we talked about how you're going to work with a writing tutor. When are you going to do that, DO? Because remember that DUE date is coming up. So when are you going to do that? ADHD learners need help with that sort of backward design to help them land the plane, to help them finish the assignments. And then in an ideal world, I'm waving my magic wand here, our ADHD learners need dedicated academic coaches. So many folks who are outside of higher ed, out in the wild, living their normal lives, when they get that ADHD diagnosis, and a lot of these conversations are taking place on social media, have a tremendous amount of success with using coaches. So the coaching model of meeting with somebody once a week, I've used one myself. It was incredibly helpful. Meeting with somebody once a week to say, what are your goals this week? When are you going to do it? And all right, I'm going to hold you accountable. Let's come up with a plan. You can do this, that positive support, cheerleader energy. Our ADHD learners all need a dedicated academic coach, at least to start. And then, of course, as they get further along, they might be able to wean off of that and learn and use those skills themselves. But certainly our first year ADHD learners need this. This would be one of the smartest investments of our, I'm not going to go off at the way that we spend our money sometimes in higher education, but this would be one of the most cost-effective ways to support student success, faculty success, student retention and completion would be to hook our ADHD learners up with dedicated academic coaches. So I hope that was helpful. The goal here is to help our students land the plane, to finish their assignments, to finish their courses, to achieve their goals. It's not to get rid of those gorgeous thoughts about the clouds and relationships and connections, but it's to recognize that at some point, in order to move on to the next best thing in our lives, we've got to land the plane. So let's help our learners do this. All right. Thank you, everybody. And thanks to my friend Tom from Twitter for the inspiration. It was great talking with you all. I hope we can keep talking about this. And subscribe. I always forget to say that. Subscribe to my YouTube channel. That helps you get notified and it helps me as a YouTube creator. Thanks, everybody.